Hello, friends. Welcome to the SIPS series. These foundational strategies were nominated by listeners. They told me these are the ideas in the podcast that truly made a difference for them. So I distilled them down into short, actionable insights. There's not going to be any fluff or complex jargon, just practical, real-world diabetes management that you can start applying today. And I know your time is valuable, so we're keeping these short. Another small sip will come out once a week for the foreseeable future. If you like what you hear, check out the Pro Tip series or the Bold Beginnings series for more. Those series are available in the menu at juiceboxpodcast.com, and you can find complete lists of all of the series in the featured tab on the private Facebook group. Please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. The questions you have, I guarantee you, there's answers to them in the Juicebox Podcast, and it's all free. All right, Jenny, I appreciate you doing this with me again. We are going to talk about stopping the arrows today.
Oh, fun.
So this came up originally in Defining Diabetes that we did in 286, where I think we were just talking about visual cues that we were using in Dexcom or any CGM really to make decisions about diabetes. So I'd like to hear from you first. How do you utilize arrows on CGMs? Do you pay attention to them? Is the number more important to you? How do you think about it?
I think the arrows can actually be more beneficial than the number value itself, because we know that CGMs can be a little bit off of a finger stick in general. Mm-hmm. And when your number is changing, or you've got that arrow or the directional line of the dots on your system showing you that things are shifting and changing, whether it's a rise or a fall in your glucose value. Mm-hmm. But the number isn't exactly a finger stick value. It is giving you information about what's happening right now, though. And so when I look at, my arrows, for example, I expect a little bit of a trend up in the aftermath of eating something, but I also know enough about the types of things that I eat that I could expect, based on timing, knowledge, and everything else, that arrows shouldn't be dramatic. Mm-hmm. Like I should not get, in fact, I don't know the last time I actually got like a double arrow up, right, or even a single arrow up. But in general, a nice stable sort of course up in the aftermath of eating something. You might get a little bit of that angled arrow trend mm-hmm. up in the aftermath of a meal. But you also have to think in that scenario, again, not based on the number, but based on the trend that's happening. Okay, I just ate.
Yeah.
I expect a little bit of a shift in my blood sugar. It's not going to stay flat in most cases. Some eating styles, sure, but in general, it's going to coast up a bit. At a certain point, however, after the meal and the bolus, it should plateau. Mm-hmm. It should stabilize. You shouldn't any longer have that trend up arrow or that angled arrow up. It should plateau. And then eventually, over not a terribly long period of time, maybe 30 minutes, it should actually start to kind of come back down. Right. So we're looking for a bell curve when we're looking at data around meal times. In times that aren't around meals, though, those arrows can give you more information about what you might need to do too, because if you're in a fasting time, like overnight, and you just so happen to wake to an alarm that you've got set for a high or a low blood sugar, and you have a trend arrow happening there, it might actually cue you into doing a finger stick mm-hmm. to evaluate whether that's true or not, and to take a course of action, because now, assuming there's not any food or anything else happening, the trend up might actually need some assistance. You might need to do something about it. Or the trend down, you might need to do something about it to stop it, because clearly you have nothing else impacting the change right now.
So I think when I said originally, like, I think about stopping the arrows, it was when I was trying to figure out how to use the insulin. right? Like,
Mhm.
so to your point, I like that you said aftermath after a meal. Like it was like a car accident and everybody's just like dazed
Well,
out in the street.
sometimes people talk about it. It seems like kind of like it is like a whole like atrocious situation that sounds like you ate.
People
It's
just wandering around and there's smoke in the air. Like, what happened?
right.
You
That is
ate.
kind of funny.
Yeah. And so I just loved it when you said aftermath. That was so what I was trying to get at back then in these episodes, but by the way, comes up again in episode 327, episode 125. Like it's a thing I've talked about a lot. But before algorithms and before really understanding firmly how insulin was working, I was teaching myself about the value of my bolus by what the arrow was doing afterwards, right? Like, and to your
Correct.
point, like nowadays, I mean, if I saw a double arrow in either direction nowadays, I don't even think I'd be like, what just like, I don't understand. But back then, they were happening constantly, right?
Sure.
But back then, I didn't understand pre-bolusing. If you listen back, you can hear that as Arden was growing, because Arden was diagnosed when she was so small, as she was growing, her office never changed her insulin to carb ratio.
Oh, her endo office? Really?
Yeah, they did. And her also the insulin sensitivity. Like I looked one day and it was like 1 unit moves her 300 points. And I was like, that's not true at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then I realized like these settings are being ignored by people and they're important. She's grown. She's gotten bigger. Her basal doesn't change. She's grown. She's gotten bigger. Nobody changed her insulin sensitivity. I'm like,
which is one that drives me crazy. That sensitivity factor, correction factor. It is the least adjusted of all the 3 knobs, so to speak, that you can kind of turn, right? We've got basal, insulin to carb, correction factor. It's the one that gets left in the corner by itself. Nobody fixes it.
Yeah, I was stunned. I mean, once I figured everything out, I was stunned. While it was happening, I didn't even think twice about it. I wasn't pre-bolusing. Her settings were way off. She'd eat something. Her blood sugar would definitely, 2 hours were happening all the time. I even think back then I was blaming the insulin at one point. Like,
probably.
I actually think that I love Apidra. Arden's been using it forever. I find it very smooth for her. But I think I made the switch because I thought it was Novolog's fault that we were seeing these double arrows. Because I was out of ideas about like
what to do.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, like this kind of fundamental idea I had back before the settings were right and I knew what I was doing is I would think I have to stop the arrows. Right. So like before I understood that I wasn't using enough insulin, I at least knew I should not be seeing this arrow up. And I kind of set these lines in my head. Like if, in the first 30 minutes after she ate, she was rising quickly or she got over 140 and it looked like she was going to go to 160. I assumed I didn't use enough insulin. I put more insulin in. Nowadays, I still use that, but it just doesn't come up as much. But what really ended up happening was the people listening to the podcast who also were in a situation where they didn't understand that there were 3 settings they needed to be looking at, that they were probably all wrong, that they were timing their insulin incorrectly, etc. They found that phrase, stop the arrows, to be really helpful in the beginning while they're learning,
Mm-hmm. While you were saying that, learning about how to stop the arrows, I imagined you're like in my head, the scenario of like packing your backpack full of whatever you're going to leave the house with to take care of whatever force was invading your home at that point. I was like,
it felt like an attack.
Just imagine it's like you're in this war against something,
against the arrows, like really, because that's what because the number, to your point, listen, CGMs are fantastic, but the speed, direction, that information is super, super helpful, maybe more so than the number, right? But yeah, that's exactly what it felt like. I was like, everything felt like it's coming for you all the time. Like, you know what I mean? Like, here comes the arrow's coming. I don't know how it got here. I don't know how to kill it. I don't know how to stop it without it turning into a different arrow that I don't want to see.
Right.
Anyway, as a general management idea, I think when you see straight arrows in either direction, they need intervention. So it's obvious when you're dropping fast that you need intervention, but I don't think it's so obvious, at least in the beginning, to people that those straight arrows up mean I've significantly mistimed and miscalculated my insulin.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
and
all.
I think those straight arrows are definitely, angled arrows, you're likely to see more often, especially angled arrows that are coasting up slightly again I was going to say it again, the aftermath of a meal.
Well, it is. I mean, if it's going like this, yeah.
And to not be too, again, this is where the understanding of insulin and how insulin works along with food becomes really valuable, because if you're just trying to stop the arrow and it's 20 minutes after you've eaten a meal, you haven't really given that insulin enough time to do justice, right? So I think there is a timing or an evaluation time to look for that arrow and say, okay, I know I still have insulin working here. I'm going to wait 30 minutes and hope for that plateau, hope for the turning point that it's not going up anymore. The insulin really is taking action, and they're kind of that tug of war idea that you created. They're working together. The insulin, the carbs, they're working together, and now it's going to coast back down. The up and down arrows, like you said, those straight arrows, those are the ones that usually indicate either something is amiss with the insulin site, the pump site, right? Is it leaking? Has it been pulled loose? Is it disconnected? Because if this is a normal meal for you, that shouldn't be happening. But the other piece would be if you got a straight arrow up or a straight arrow down, it's probably timing that was the best.
If you're using the right amount of insulin and you're still seeing a straight up arrow, you may have just let the food get ahead of the insulin by not pre-bolusing enough. I kind of think there's two different ways to think about this. Like, there's the way to think about it once you're in my position and your position where you know your settings are good, right? Like, once you know your settings are good, if you see those drastic arrows, you're like, oh, this is timing, or I didn't use enough insulin, or I've miscalculated the impact this food's going to have, something like that. Back when you don't know what you're doing and it's just starting out, like, to your point, you don't want to bolus for a meal 15 minutes later, see an up arrow and just start pouring in more insulin, because you don't know what's going on. Like, that might be a time to sit back and evaluate and say to yourself, for next time, I'm going to try to get the insulin in enough time that this doesn't happen, that this food doesn't come in and just crush and overtake the insulin because it's not working yet. If this makes sense to you and you want to learn more, go to the Pro Tip series to try to learn more about how to get your insulin settings set up. Thank you.
Perfect.
That was awesome.
Yes.
Are you starting to see patterns, but you can't quite make sense of them? You're like, oh, if I bolus here, this happens, but I don't know what to do. Should I put in a little less, a little more? If you're starting to have those thoughts, if you're starting to think, this isn't going the way the doctor said it would, I think I see something here, but I can't be sure. Once you're having those thoughts, you're ready for the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast. It begins at episode 1000. You can also find it at juiceboxpodcast.com up in the menu. And you can find a list in the private Facebook group. Just check right under the featured tab at the top. It'll show you lists of a ton of stuff, including the Pro Tip series, which runs from episode 1000 to 1025. If you or a loved one was just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and you're looking for some fresh perspective, the Bold Beginnings series from the Juicebox Podcast is a terrific place to start. That series is with myself and Jenny Smith. Jenny is a CDCES, a registered dietitian, and a type 1 for over 35 years. And in the Bold Beginnings series, Jenny and I are going to answer the questions that most people have after a type 1 diabetes diagnosis. The series begins at episode 698 in your podcast player, or you can go to juiceboxpodcast.com and click on Bold Beginnings in the menu. If you're not already subscribed or following in your favorite audio app, please take the time now to do that. It really helps the show. And get those automatic downloads set up so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast.